What if those Viking legends, the sagas and stories,
Mhm.
what if they aren't just stories? What if there's something tangible, something actually etched into the DNA of modern Norwegians? And imagine if that genetic legacy connects not just to, say, strength or coping with a cold, but maybe also to mental resilience, a unique immune system, and maybe even some really controversial links to things like aggression. So our mission for this deep dive is to explore this really intriguing world of Norwegian genetics, because scientists are uncovering secrets here that are genuinely reshaping how we think about ancestry, identity, maybe even evolution itself in the Nordic region.
Yeah, we're definitely going on a bit of a journey here. We'll be sifting through quite a few different findings, trying to understand why this specific gene pool has become, well, so discussed and sometimes misunderstood, often kind of mythologized. We'll look at the actual data, some surprising connections, and naturally, the ethical questions that pop up.
Okay, so let's start right there. Let's unpack this idea that Norway's gene pool is like a direct living link to ancient Norse populations. What's kind of amazing is just how well preserved this genetic legacy seems to be, like time almost stopped.
It's it's incredibly clear when you look at the genetic markers, really striking. For instance, researchers found that, get this, over 38% of Norwegian men carry the Y-DNA haplogroup I1. Now, for anyone less familiar, a haplogroup is basically a big family tree branch showing a common ancestor way back either on the male or female line. It leaves a distinct genetic signature. And this specific one, I1, it's strongly associated with those ancient Germanic and, yes, Viking male lines.
38%. That sounds pretty high.
It is. And what's really intriguing is that this proportion is actually higher than in Denmark. You know, Denmark is often considered the main homeland of the original Norse raiders. So that's interesting.
What?
And it's not just the male side. If you look at the maternal lines, the mtDNA data, you see a really strong concentration of haplogroup H and also U5b. And this suggests a continuous maternal lineage stretching back, well, an astonishing 8,000 years.
8,000 years. Wow. So if these ancient genetic echoes are still so clear, the big question then is, how does this actually play out today? What does this deep historical blueprint mean for Norwegians living right now? Which I guess leads us straight into how Norwegians might be, well, literally adapted to their environment, genetically speaking.
Yeah.
You read these studies, and they found specific genetic variants, alleles, linked to things like cold resistance and how they process vitamin D. And these seem much more common in Norwegians than in, say, most other European groups.
That's right. A 2020 Nordic genome report, for example, it showed Norwegians have about a 26% higher frequency of certain UCP1 gene variants.
UCP1, remind me.
Think of it like a tiny internal thermostat gene. These variants help the body burn what's called brown fat much more efficiently to generate heat. It's almost like having a built-in biological furnace against the cold.
Okay, a biological furnace. I like that.
And then there are variations in other genes, CYP2R1 and GC. These seem to improve how efficiently they can synthesize vitamin D, even when there's very little sunlight, which is obviously a huge survival advantage during those long, dark Nordic winters.
Right. So if you're thinking about human resilience, how we cope with tough climates, this is a really powerful example. It's not just about putting on an extra jumper. It's like millennia of harsh winters have actually written survival tactics into their very genome, biologically engineered for the North, almost. Is this kind of adaptation seen as strongly elsewhere, say in other Arctic populations? Or is Norway particularly distinct here?
Well, you see adaptation everywhere, of course. It's a spectrum. But the specific combination and the sheer frequency of these particular alleles in Norway, yeah, that does seem quite distinct. It likely reflects a very long, very consistent pressure from their specific environment over thousands of years.
Okay. But then, not all the genetic links are about practical adaptations like keeping warm. Some get into much more difficult territory, like this so-called warrior gene. That sounds like a fire starter.
It is indeed. It's definitely a controversial topic. Several studies have found a slightly higher prevalence of a variant called MAOAL among Scandinavian men, including Norwegians. Now, this variant has been controversially linked to an increased risk of reactive aggression. And this is really crucial, especially when it's combined with things like childhood trauma.
Okay. So it's not deterministic on its own.
Absolutely not. And many researchers caution very strongly against, stigmatizing entire populations based on something like this. Genetic determinism is just not how it works. Others, however, do suggest it might have played some complex role in, say, historical Viking behavior, maybe influencing temperaments back then. It's debated.
I can imagine.
Yeah, the debate is pretty robust. Critics often call this kind of discussion genetic profiling. And it's definitely still a very sensitive area in behavioral genetics, especially when you start linking potential predispositions to ancestral groups known for conflict.
That is incredibly sensitive. You mentioned some researchers suggest a link, but are there strong voices pushing back? Maybe saying it's more about sociology, environment, or that the genetic signal is just too weak compared to everything else that shapes behavior. It really highlights that tightrope walk between scientific curiosity and, well, the ethical responsibility that comes with these findings.
Oh, absolutely. There are many strong counterarguments. Most emphasize the huge role of environment, upbringing, social factors, the whole nature versus nurture debate, but it's really nature and nurture interacting. Genes are never the sole determinant. It's always a complex interplay, and the scientific community is, frankly, still figuring out how best to interpret and talk about these very nuanced predispositions responsibly.
Okay, so moving away from the controversy for a moment, let's look at some other traits. Like Norwegians are known for being tall, right? They're often listed among the top 10 tallest populations globally.
They are. And geneticists think part of that might be down to genes like GH1 and IGF-1 receptors. These genes help regulate growth, and they seem to pop up quite frequently in Norwegian DNA samples.
Right.
And something else that's quite fascinating is their immune system. A review in 2023, the Scandinavian Immunogenetics Review, showed Norwegians often carry a high frequency of particular allele, HLA-DRB104. This specific one is linked to a stronger immune response, especially against respiratory infections.
Like colds and flu.
Exactly. And the thinking is this might be an evolutionary leftover, an adaptation from living in icy, relatively pathogen-scarce regions where maybe different kinds of immune challenges shaped their defenses over time.
So maybe fewer types of bugs, but you needed a strong response to the ones that were there.
Possibly. That's one hypothesis.
Okay, so we've got Viking echoes, cold adaptation, height, immunity, and this controversial aggression link. If we step back and look at the bigger picture, all this growing interest in Norwegian genetics, it seems to have really stirred things up in bioethics circles, hasn't it? It feels like it's moved beyond just lab results now.
It really has. That's spot on. The core questions people are asking now are quite fundamental, like, should this idea of Viking DNA be romanticized? Or should we be questioning that narrative much more critically? Are Norwegians perhaps being idealized in some corners of, say, the modern ancestral fitness movement?
Right, I've seen some of that online.
Exactly. And then the deeper question, is this just neutral science reporting on findings? Or does it risk slipping into something closer to nationalism? Or maybe just selective storytelling, highlighting the bits that fit a certain image while ignoring the rest of the complex picture.
Yeah, that's a real danger.
And we're seeing real-world impacts already. Some genetic testing companies have definitely started using Viking DNA as a kind of marketing hook, which has drawn criticism, understandably. Some argue it subtly promotes a problematic myth, almost like racial superiority, even if unintentionally. And then you have crucial counter-narratives. Indigenous Sani communities in Norway, for instance, they've quite rightly pushed back, emphasizing that Norway's genetic heritage is far deeper, far more diverse than any single Viking-centric story can capture.
That's a really important point. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it? How the same scientific data can be spun into so many different narratives, depending on who's telling the story and why. So this really brings us to the crunch question for you listening to this. How do we take all this information on board? How does it fit into our understanding of identity today? We've seen how Norwegian genetics can look like this incredible survival blueprint, shaped by ice and maybe conquest. But at the same time, it can be seen as this much more complex genetic tapestry, maybe one that's being colored by, well, selective science or even marketing.
And that leaves us with some big provocative thoughts to chew on. Like, does something like Viking DNA actually still influence behavior today? Or are those historical connections far more subtle, far more nuanced than any simple genetic link implies? Are those cold-adapted genes really the defining feature? Or is it this incredibly rich mix of genetics, lifestyle, environment, history, and maybe just sheer chance that makes Norwegians who they are? And it may be the biggest question of all, as we learn more and more about the human genome, should we even be framing these kinds of questions around specific populations? What are the risks?
It is definitely a lot to consider, and ultimately how you interpret this powerful, complex information. Well, that decision is yours. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.